What if you were 6 years old and your parents were terrifying? If everything about your life was terrifying? This is the story of a 6-year-old boy named Wesley Allen Mercer and his parents, Christopher Sepulvado and Yvonne Mercer. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Neckties and Alibis, where I talk about all things murder and crime. If this is your first time here, please like and subscribe. I'm hoping to come out with content at least once a week. Now, before I dive into this story, I just want you to take a few minutes just to think about how life was for you at 6. Now, you may already be in kindergarten, you may have completed it. I know it depends on your age, but I just want you to think about 6 years old and what 6 years old was for you. Now, 6 years old for me I was carefree. The weight of the world was not on my shoulders. I remember I was learning to color in the lines. I wanted to hang out with my friends. I actually enjoyed school. It was a time when you had your parents, and your parents were your heroes, right? They were your heroes. If you were scared of the dark, you would call for your mom or dad to come protect you. If there was a monster under your bed, they would come and rescue you, essentially. They would look in the closet, they'd look under the bed, and then tell you that you were safe. Or they might tell you to come sleep in the bed with them. So just hold that thought in your head. Now imagine being 6 years old and all of that stuff that we said earlier was not the case. What if you were 6 years old and your parents were terrifying? If everything about your life was terrifying? This is the story of a 6-year-old boy named Wesley Allen Mercer and his parents, Christopher Sepulvado and Yvonne Mercer. Wesley Allen Mercer was born October 6th of 1985 in a very quiet and unknown town called Wichita, Louisiana. Now, I've never heard of this. If you are Duck Dynasty fans, then you may have, because that actually is where Duck Dynasty came out of. So congratulations if you do. This story is not about them, but this is something that actually happened in that town, and it is terrifying. Now, Wesley had both of his parents at the time, John and Yvonne Mercer. Now, Yvonne would later go on to say that she felt pressured into marrying John. I guess she maybe felt that it was the right thing to do to get married to him, and so she went ahead with it. Wesley would come soon after them actually marrying. So fate would have it that they would break up. I mean, if she was marrying him in the first place just because she felt pressure, she really didn't want to do it, that was bound to happen. Wesley was about 4 years old at this time. So they moved back in with Yvonne's parents. But shortly after, in 1990, it was September of 1990, Yvonne would actually meet a man named Christopher Sepulvado. She was feeling like most people feel when they meet a new person. It's butterflies in your stomach. You're on like this new high, bragging about your partner and just all of the new experiences that you get with them. By January of 1991, despite like the protests of Yvonne's parents, she did not approve of her relationship with Christopher at all. And Yvonne actually wanted to move in with Christopher. So they were quite upset with it, but she did. She took little Wesley and she moved in with Christopher. This would actually be one of the biggest mistakes that Yvonne has ever made in her whole life. So she packed up all of her things and she actually moved to a town called Mansfield, Louisiana. And she was just hoping for this fresh start with Christopher. She thought that he was going to be everything and she would get everything that she couldn't get or didn't have from her relationship and marriage with John. However, once she moved into the house, Christopher's true side began to come out and things were starting to unravel about him. He actually drank pretty heavily. And when this happened, he would take out his anger on Yvonne. He would verbally and physically abuse her. So by May 10th of 1991, Yvonne actually packed up her stuff and took Wesley and went back to her parents' house again. Now, we know what happens typically after a breakup. If you leave someone, the other person's apologizing, they're promising that it won't happen again. And if you're unlucky, you listen and you go back. So especially in a situation where there's abuse, there's a cycle that you get into and it's very difficult to get away from. So what did Yvonne decide to do? Well, for one, she listened to Christopher and she decided to move back in with Christopher. But this time she wanted to leave Wesley with her parents. Now, I don't know why she decided to do this. Maybe it was because she wanted to give Christopher a chance. If Christopher was still going to be abusive to her, then she could just up and leave and she wasn't dragging Wesley through this again. So Yvonne's grandparents essentially had to take care of Wesley during this second trial, I guess you would call it. But as we know, cycles usually repeat themselves, especially with abuse. And she packed up once again and moved back into her parents' house. Now, you would think that most people would actually leave. They would know, okay, nothing's changing about the situation. And it's actually getting worse. I'm teaching him to treat me this way, essentially. But when it comes to abuse and abusive cycles, I don't want to say it's an addiction, but it kind of does get that way for some. It's the fighting that it creates something afterwards. And it's like you're chasing that high. When you fight, everything's bad, and then you reconnect and everything's great. So it's like you keep chasing that feeling. And I believe that, that's the case that happened here. Yvonne packs up her things once more and she goes back to her parents' house and moves in. But because she was chasing this feeling or listening to what Christopher was saying, she decided, okay, I'm going to move back in with Christopher. And unfortunately, she decides to bring Wesley this time. Maybe Christopher was telling her, listen, I know that I did all these things to you, but I want to be a family and we're going to make this work. So she listened and she brought Wesley. The thing is if Christopher is a broken person, he was a broken person. I mean, that's obvious because you don't treat people that way. So if he's not recognizing his brokenness and fixing that and sobering up, then there's no way that he's going to be able to live up to everything he's telling her, all of these lies that he's telling Yvonne, that he's going to be a good father to Christopher and a good father to their future kids, that he's going to sober up. None of that's going to happen in there, just empty promises. But unfortunately, she did move back in there. And now she's put Wesley directly into the path of this abusive alcoholic. Now, for whatever reason, when they move back in, Yvonne is spared from the abuse of Christopher. It's actually being passed on to her son, Wesley. Now, he's only 6 years old, and this guy who is supposed to be his father figure is now all of a sudden, he's not only verbally abusing Wesley, he's actually physically abusing him. And at that point, you would expect Yvonne to step in because she's aware of this abuse. She's a stay-at-home mom, by the way. She does not work. So she's well aware of what's happening in the house. Christopher is verbally abusing, he's physically abusing Wesley. Yvonne does not step in, and actually she's helping. She's assisting. She's passing on punishment to Wesley on top of what Christopher has done. Now, if you can imagine the type of abuse that Christopher was probably doing to Yvonne, pushing her around, screaming at her. Now, imagine he's using that same force and that same voice to a 6-year-old boy. He has to be scared out of his mind over this. I imagine at that point he's wondering, who is he supposed to tell? Who is he supposed to run to save him? He has absolutely nobody. He might have his grandparents, but at 6 years old, how do you contact them? Part of me feels like Yvonne actually was a bit relieved that she was no longer taking the abuse. But this is something that really bothers me when I was learning about this story. As a mother, how do you not step in to protect your child? It's a natural instinct. You would die for your child. But in this situation, she, for whatever reason, felt that she didn't need to, or she was just relieved that it wasn't happening to her. While going through the story and looking at some of the pictures on here, the one thing that I noticed, and it was kind of eerie, looking at the photos of Wesley, he was actually never smiling. And that says a lot because, as you know, 6-year-olds are, they're crazy. A lot of times when you watch them, they're jumping up and down. They're constantly laughing. They're fun. They are the epitome of fun. But he wasn't smiling. He didn't seem like he was laughing. When you look at his pictures, you see just fear and just a serious nature to it. And I just wonder why nobody questioned that. On March 5th, 1992, after almost a full year of Yvonne moving back into the house with Christopher and bringing Wesley, she does the unthinkable. She decides to marry Christopher. This decision would actually forever alter Wesley's life. It would seal his fate. Instead of celebrating that day, what takes place over the course of the next few days is horrifying. And it's terrible that the 6-year-old boy had to endure this. Normally, it would have been a happy time for somebody to get married and you would celebrate, but it was the complete opposite of that. Christopher's abuse on Wesley would actually intensify. It would become the worst that it had been. So on March 6th, 1992, Wesley came home from school. Yvonne and Christopher had discovered that Wesley had an accident. He had actually defecated in his pants that day. Now, immediately, as a mother, you would want to clean them up, first of all, and you'd want to know what happened, if there's anything that you can help. Accidents do happen, but I'm wondering, was this a typical occurrence? Did this happen all the time? Did this happen once Yvonne moved in with Christopher and he was being abusive? Like, connect the dots. Something's going on. He's 6 years old and this is happening. But Yvonne didn't do that. Yvonne did not run to Wesley to help him. She didn't care. In fact, she spanked Wesley. She spanked him for pooping in his pants. But that wasn't enough. She told him that he was not allowed to have dinner. She denied him food because of this, because he was 6 years old and had an accident. On top of that, it gets worse. On top of that, Christopher wanted to punish Wesley as well. So it wasn't enough that he had already been spanked. It wasn't enough that he couldn't eat dinner. I think that Christopher was actually eager to discipline Wesley. I think that this was kind of his moment to take this beyond his typical abuse. Christopher would take a rope and he would tie it around a ceiling fan and he'd make a noose. And then he would go on to have Wesley come in the room and see the noose hanging and would tell him, if you poop your pants again, then I'm actually going to hang you from this noose. And after telling him that, he made Wesley go get a chair, and Wesley was instructed to stand on the chair, lift up one leg, and start counting. And God only knows how long he kept him there counting with one leg up. 6-year-old boy, hungry at this point, and still in his dirty clothes. Now, unfortunately, I'm assuming because Wesley at this point was terrified, he actually had 2 more accidents in his pants that evening. Now, the second time that it happened, Christopher severely whipped him. So he beat Wesley so bad. Now, I'm imagining that at this point, Wesley feels hopeless. He probably has no control over his bowels because he is terrified. So it's not like this is anything that he can stop himself from doing. He has nobody to run to. He can't even tell his mom what's going on. I mean, she should already know. But the third time that this happens, Christopher actually takes Wesley and he shoves his head into the toilet. Now, if you think that that's bad, what Yvonne and Christopher make Wesley do next is he's instructed that he cannot clean himself off and he's not allowed to sleep in his bed. So he has to sleep on this trunk that is in his room. It's positioned next to his bed. He has to sit on that, sitting up. He has to go to sleep sitting up on that. Cannot touch his bed, cannot clean himself. He just has to go to sleep and he's sitting up. So I can imagine just what he had to go through in that moment, having that bed next to him and knowing the comfort of it. But he's not allowed to do it. And he's scared because what if he does climb into that bed? What's going to happen? So the following day on March 7th, 1992, Christopher would immediately tell Yvonne in the morning, listen, I don't want Wesley to eat today either. So you need to let him know he's not eating his food again. This is his punishment and that's what is going to happen. So Yvonne tells Wesley this, but she also goes ahead and she takes this a step further and she hits Wesley and she yanks his hair, pulls his hair as another form of punishment. And so that day he's gone all day long without eating. I believe this is a Saturday. That evening, again, he's still wearing those soiled clothes. And same thing, he cannot sleep in his bed. He has to sleep on the trunk, sitting up next to his bed, forbidden to go into it, forbidden to clean himself, forbidden to eat. It's a very sad and torturous situation that he's in. It's sickening. It's disgusting. So the following day on March 8th, Wesley wakes up and of course he's exhausted because he was sleeping sitting up on a trunk all night for the second night in a row and he's starving. What does Christopher do? Christopher's punishment is not over. He still wants Wesley to suffer. He's so angry that Wesley keeps pooping in his pants and he wants to teach him a lesson. Now, instead of being a caring parent and wondering what they can do to help him, Christopher doesn't realize that he's the one. Him and Yvonne are actually the reason why Wesley keeps pooping in his pants. Christopher, still angry, physically kicks Wesley into the bathroom that morning. And he tells him that he needs to get cleaned up. So he's allowed to bathe. He needs to get cleaned up and ready for church. And that if he poops in his pants again today, he's going to scald him with hot water. Wesley pauses for a second. And I imagine he's just, what is this guy telling me? I'm tired. I'm hungry. I can bathe and I need to get ready for church, but he's going to put hot water on me. And just in that moment of him freezing and that hesitation, Christopher, not even thinking about what this little boy is going through, immediately reacts. There's a screwdriver in the bathroom and Christopher actually picks it up and takes the back of it and he starts hitting Wesley over the head several times that Wesley actually passes out and hits the floor. Now, during this time that Wesley is laying on the floor helpless, unconscious, Christopher makes the decision to fill up the bathtub with scalding hot water. At some point, he picks up Wesley's unconscious body and he lays him down into this tub of severely hot water. Once he does this, he at some point picks up Wesley and I don't know if he wakes up, maybe he woke up in the tub while this was happening, but he was instructed to eat. He was allowed to eat some food finally. Once he ate, he actually vomited and he collapsed again, completely unconscious. So at some time around, I think it was 1:50 in the afternoon, Yvonne and Christopher decided to take Wesley to DeSoto General Hospital. They claimed that Wesley had an accident and he had fallen into the tub. But upon arrival, Wesley was not breathing. Despite all of the efforts of the medical staff, all of the attempts to try to revive Wesley, they were unsuccessful. And tragically, around 2 p.m. that afternoon, 6-year-old Wesley Allen Mercer was pronounced dead. The following day, there was an autopsy performed by George McCormick. And it was determined that the cause of death was actually two things. It was failure of the heart and the lungs, and it was brought on by severe burns that were covering 60% of Wesley's body. Now, most of those burns were concentrated on his backside. The report showed that 58% of his body suffered third-degree burns, while the remaining 2% was affected by second-degree burns. So the majority of the burns that were on the back, those were the worst. Third-degree burns. The report indicated that the scalding was so severe that the victim's skin had essentially burned away. The medical examiner also noted that Wesley was severely beaten. It's quoted, he said, "The victim's scalp had separated from his skull due to hemorrhaging and bruising." It was also noted that there were bruises on his backside, which was not consistent with some sort of accidental falling, like Christopher had stated. So both Christopher and Yvonne were actually immediately arrested on suspicion of child abuse. Christopher had admitted that he hit Wesley with a screwdriver, but he maintained that Wesley was the one that had slipped and fell into the bathtub. However, the prosecution presented expert testimony in this case, and it contradicted Christopher's claim. The burn patterns on Wesley's body did not suggest an accidental fall. In fact, the absence of the splash marks on his body would indicate that he was placed into the bathtub. And there was no struggle because Wesley was unconscious. Detectives would go on to say that when they were surveying Christopher's home, they actually went to the water heater and they checked to see what temperature the water heater was set at. It was set at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you can imagine, Christopher turned the hot water nozzle on, didn't even have the cold water. He turned it on 210 degrees and placed an unconscious Wesley into the water. On April 17th, 1993, after all of the trials went on, Christopher Sepulvado was actually found guilty of first-degree murder. And 2 days later, on April 19th, 1993, the jury recommended the death penalty. And on May 24th, Judge Robert E. Burgess sentenced 49-year-old Christopher to death. As for Yvonne, she was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 21 years in prison. However, she served just 7.5 years and was released in 2002. After her release, she would actually remarry. In a 2013 interview, Yvonne would state that she feels sorrow over Wesley's death and that she felt partly responsible for what happened. I don't know. I can't, for one, I can't get over that she should have gotten the death penalty, or she should have been locked up for life for this. And for her to just say that she feels partly responsible, it's kind of a kick in the teeth. So she says that she should have left. She maintained that she never killed her son, but in my eyes, she totally did because she didn't stop any of the abuse. Yvonne would actually later go on and write a book. It's titled A Time to Heal. And she talks about her whole life there, even going through marrying John and what happens later. I mean, most of it you can read online. Probably 7 chapters are free to read. It's a lot of nonsense if you ask me, but feel free to read it if you want to see what a mother of a child who lets a step-parent abuse her son talks about. So during this time of Christopher's incarceration, he actually tried to appeal against his conviction to get out of the death penalty and pretty much exhausted every appeal that he had sent. So he went through the Louisiana Supreme Court, then he went through the U.S. Supreme Court. All of them were getting rejected. So during this time, a lot happened. There was a lot going on with the chemical compounds that they used for the lethal injection. Europe decided not to, supply it for us anymore for lethal injection. So the US came up with their own version, and there was a lot of stuff going on between that where it was not approved. So during this time, Christopher is just sitting in prison. And on top of that, on December 9th, 2017, the U.S. Judge James Brady, who was in charge of hearing the lawsuit, died. He died from an illness. So they had to suspend everything that was going on with the case. And again, Christopher was allowed to just sit on death row in prison. So he's keeping warm, he's being fed, his belly's full, he's getting to sleep on a bed at night, and everything, all of the executions are suspended So once everything had picked back up, of course, Christopher and his lawyer go back to trying to protest against executing Christopher. He's a lot older, and his lawyer's trying to state that because of this, he should not be put to death. But of course, that was not going to happen. This is Louisiana after all. So in 2024, late 2024, executions in the state were able to resume. Prisoners now had another option. Instead of lethal injection, they were actually able to choose nitrous oxide. And because Christopher had been on death row for years, he actually was one of the first in line to meet his maker. On February 12th, 2025, Judge McCartney signed a death warrant for Sepulvado and scheduled his death sentence to be carried out on March 17th, 2025. Christopher at this point was 81 years old. He was the oldest inmate on death row there in Louisiana. Chris's lawyers argued that at this point he was wheelchair bound, and at this advanced age he was suffering from multiple serious medical ailments, and that he had grown remorseful during his time on death row, and that there should be some judicial mercy and compassion. But there was none, and they continued to move along with his execution. Now, while I was working on this video, I awoke one day to the news on my computer screen that actually told me that Christopher died in his sleep on February 23rd, 2025. So this was 2 weeks after his execution was scheduled, mind you, and 3 weeks before he was supposed to be executed. They said that Christopher died of natural causes, but what actually happened was Christopher got sick. Christopher had to go in for, I think it was knee surgery or leg surgery. Christopher denied it. He said, no, I absolutely do not want to do this. And so because of him choosing not to do this, he actually got gangrene. He got sick. So, I mean, there was a little bit of suffering, a fever maybe, but he died in his sleep. So he didn't get the execution that he deserved. He was able to go to sleep one night and not wake up, which it really sucks when it comes down to it. He spent 33 years in prison, sleeping in a bed, again, being well fed, his tummy's full, showers. And really, I mean, not that it's super safe there, but safe from the outside world and people who probably wanted to kill him. But he was never executed for the murder of 6-year-old Wesley. So digging into this further, after Christopher died, there was more news coming out. So it ends up that when Christopher and Yvonne got married, she had actually had a son. His name was Jeremy Lynn Mercer, and she had just had him 3 weeks prior to getting married. So I figured that maybe the reason why Yvonne kept going back to Christopher was actually because she was pregnant. Most likely Christopher was telling her that he was going to be a good father. And he may have been a good father to his new child, but he certainly wasn't a good father to Wesley. Immediately after the murder of Wesley took place, of course, the courts came in and they took Jeremy away and they put him up for adoption. Now, once Jeremy was placed up for adoption and he was adopted, they changed his name to Jeremy Bryan. So in this interview, Jeremy goes on to say that he did meet with his father on several occasions, and he was relieved that his father had passed away in his sleep instead of getting executed, which I do not understand that. If it were my father that had committed that crime to my little brother or sibling, I would absolutely want him to go through with what the courts deemed appropriate for his crime. But it didn't happen. And there was never any justice for little 6-year-old Wesley Mercer. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. This is a new journey for me, and I would love nothing more than for you to continue on this journey with me. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you for the next episode.